Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophia Rapazzo, and tonight, along with my fantastic partner, Holly, I will be arguing in negation of the resolution. I will be reaffirming Holly's points to demonstrate that even if scientists improve their communication with the public, skepticism will remain. The affirmation's first argument is that lack of accessibility to information has created and enhanced public distrust of scientists. Accessibility to information is certainly a barrier to the public, but the affirmation misrepresents and oversimplifies the reality of societal sentiments in the US. The affirmation argues that the outdated curriculum of schools is also responsible for this divide in American society that has caused large groups to distrust the scientific community. While the educational curriculums across the US are outdated in many aspects and cannot accommodate each child's learning style, it is not the responsibility of scientists to resolve this multi-dimensional issue through improved communication, nor do they even have the authority to do so. For instance, the affirmation notes that, quote, instead of prioritizing learning and meaningful retention of information, high test scores and getting A's are prioritized, unquote. But the prioritization of academic accolades in public schools are not the fault of the scientific community and cannot be resolved by the scientific community. Scientists do not construct nationwide curriculums, state governments do. The problems with contemporary education are to be fixed through other institutions and will only be changed by altering societal and academic values. More importantly, curriculum is not the issue here. It is economic inequality that causes so many children to be disadvantaged from their peers. School readiness is often insufficient for lower income students. We cannot blame failing school curriculums and surely not scientists for state-created curriculums. How can the words of the scientific community alone attempt to repair the layers of disadvantages that marginalized groups live with every day? How can the scientific community alter their communication with the public to better accommodate children living in poverty? Feeding America finds that children who are not fed enough at home are more likely to perform academically poorly. This must be resolved through other governmental means and social programs, which is another conversation altogether. Barriers to quality, individualized education cannot be solved by improved communication, which is a fact that the affirmation does not address. Scientific distrust is simply a symptom of social and economic inequalities and a valid emotional response to this objective unfairness. Lack of governmental support that has caused poverty, radical trains of thought, and unforgivable betrayals against groups of people by the scientific community are the true root causes of skepticism. These causes must be addressed by institutions other than the scientific community in more durable ways than just quote unquote better communication to decrease skepticism. Next, the affirmation spends a lot of time demonstrating that many Americans consume educational media to illustrate their second point, that Americans desire education. However, they make sweeping generalizations and misrepresentations about the statistics they use. For example, the statistic that, quote, 66% of all US leisure travelers participate in cultural or heritage activities such as visiting museums, unquote, cannot represent the affirmation's arguments that Americans are interested in educational opportunities because most Americans are not leisure travelers. Leisure travelers tend to be those that are more educated and wealthier, meaning that they are by definition not part of America's scientific skeptics, which is the group that we need to address. A much smaller proportion of people in a higher income stratus do not have the resentments and grievances that cause them to follow anti-intellectual beliefs. Education plays a large role in those who can travel as well, according to the Pew Research Center. They highlight that, quote, 37% of those with just some college education or less have not left the country, compared with only 7% of those who have graduated college, unquote. Additionally, the Pew Research Center writes that 51% of those making $30,000 or less per year have left the country, whereas 90% of those making $80,000 or more have left the country. Another statistic used by the affirmation that does not support their argument is the statistic that, quote, 41% of Americans ages 12 or older have listened to a podcast in the past month, unquote. There are many types of podcasts about sports, entertainment, and culture where education is not necessarily the focus. In fact, many podcasts that reinforce anti-intellectual beliefs or political conservatism associated with scientific distrust are on the rise. For instance, Vulture highlights that, quote, if you were to scan the Apple podcast charts today, you'd find that a tremendous portion of the shows occupying the top 200 spots are explicitly right-wing podcasts, unquote. Many forms of media serve as echo chambers that popularize and normalize anti-scientific ideas and positions on political issues, such as climate change and vaccines. Hawley demonstrated how conservatives tend to distrust media outlets and will therefore limit their consumption of media to select sources. This, of course, compounds the nature of the echo chamber. Not every person who holds anti-intellectual sentiments is listening to right-wing podcasts, but my point is to demonstrate that the affirmation statistics do not support their point that Americans desire education. Despite their use of statistics, the affirmation still fails to explain how better communication could help suffering Americans overcome institutional barriers to education, such as lack of governmental assistance to alleviate grievances causing their skepticism. The affirmation's final point is that scientists must depoliticize science, but the affirmation does not give a strategy as to how it's going to occur. They argue that, quote, too many Americans rely on politicians as sources for scientific information, unquote, and that people must hear from primary source that involves giving scientists a larger platform. The negation agrees that the politicization of science serves to increase skepticism, but how can scientists of all people depoliticize science in our polarized climate today? It is naive to assert that scientists alone can change the minds of skeptics, and the true separation of politics and science is not possible. Roger Pilk, a professor at the University of Colorado, contends that, quote, utopian views of cleanly separating science from politics and facts from values are not helpful, unquote, which speaks to how intertwined politics and science are in contemporary life. The affirmation ignores the fact that science sometimes must be first understood by the public through government in the form of policy. Science is crucial for constructing fact-based and sometimes life-saving policy. Politicizing science-based issues is a real problem, but this politicization is not the fault of scientists. The affirmation indicated that the true issue is not with the communication of the scientific community, but with the undermining of facts by politicians who are interested in personal gain and party biases. Government would be the institution for giving the scientific community a greater platform, but if many of those in government are constantly undermining scientific facts and findings, why would a skeptical public put their trust in the quote-unquote government-backed scientific community? What can the scientific community do to bolster its legitimacy when politicians with large anti-intellectual followings incessantly disparage science and perpetuate radical narratives that wipe out any chances of the scientific community's words even reaching the ears of many Americans? The affirmation has not demonstrated a viable plan for allocating massive funds and power to radically alter the way science is perceived by the public, which would theoretically cause Americans to better trust the scientific community. Of course, the redistribution of funds and complete alteration of the Constitution is not contained within our definition of communication. But perhaps the affirmation should address what ails society, which is an extraordinary loss of social status, community, lifestyle, and increasingly poor economic standing of many that have led to scientific skepticism. In sum, the affirmation has failed in constructing an argument that scientists can solve their legitimacy problem through better communication. They have presented to you general ideas without strategies for execution and solutions that are out of the scope of the capacities of the scientific community, such as updating school curriculums. They have baselessly stated that all Americans desire education by misconstruing statistics and avoid discussing the societal divides that perpetuate anti-intellectualism and skepticism of science. Finally, the affirmation again has presented a solution that scientists cannot accomplish with communication alone, which is that scientists should be given a substantially larger platform to showcase their findings. Historical mistrust from scientific abuse of marginalized communities, political echo chambers, and a rising culture of anti-intellectualism are all factors that have led to the increasingly polarized discourse surrounding scientific knowledge that we see today. This atmosphere cannot be remedied through better communication by the community that is, by definition, most antagonized by skeptics. and cannot be solved through other means unless insurmountable institutional barriers and inequalities are addressed. Thank you, and go Gators.
Great, thank you guys. So judges, you will now have 5 minutes to get your decisions back to me. And remember, afterwards, I will call on you to explain your decision. There is now an audience poll that has been launched. So the audience, please feel free to vote.